It's really nice for you to join us, even though you're not on a sort of promotional cycle at the moment. But here we are in your office, and there aren't many offices that have a racing car in them. Obviously, with this car here, we should really talk about your passion, which is motor racing. What came first? I've never asked you this before. What came first? Was it the motor racing or the music?
It was motor racing, and the reason for that is because actually when I was a very small boy, rock and roll hadn't been invented. So, if you do the maths, as they say, it becomes fairly obvious. But I was brought up in a motor racing family. My dad raced himself and made films about motor racing. So from a very early age, I was sort of hooked on the whole car thing.
And once you started getting successful with Pink Floyd, you started buying lots of cars.
I never set off to be a car collector. I still find it slightly distasteful to think of myself in those terms. I bought a racing car, and then what happened was I went racing, and I didn't have to sell the first one to buy the second one. And since racing cars are particularly unreliable, particularly old ones, it seemed to make perfect sense to have two or three and be able to, when one broke down, to have another one for another race.
Just call for another. So how many do you now have?
Basically, I do have a collection of cars now because they do lots of different things. So the oldest car is a 1901 Panhard, which does the London to Brighton. And then, I now have a family of which I think we did a count-up, and 7 of us have competition licences, 4 kids with competition licences. Myself, my wife, I've got a son-in-law who's a professional racer. Right. And all his family are professional racers, so we can sit around the table and talk about motor racing until your eyes water.
And you still race, didn't you? You've done the Le Mans. You've done Le Mans 24 hours a few times.
Yeah, I'm not doing that again. Right. I'm definitely past the.
But you're always at the sort of classic Goodwood type things.
Yeah. I still love the whole thing.
Wasn't it once where, talking about cars and going back to music, where you had to sell or mortgage one of your cars for a Pink Floyd tour?
I had to put it down as security in the '87 tour because we were facing possible litigation with Roger, and it actually never transpired. But for that reason, very few promoters were prepared to front money up. And so in order to sort of do the guarantee, I hocked the car, but I got it back. And they never actually took it away from me, but it could have been.
And that guarantee was, how much?
God knows, but a few million.
The last time we spoke, actually, in these offices, we talked about the last Pink Floyd album, Endless River. And you were quite excited about, this album, but also I think that you felt that it was, very much the end of an era, that this was the final Pink Floyd album. I wonder, that was last year that we talked about it. I wonder how you feel now, because it got sort of mixed reaction, didn't it? A critical reaction. It sold very well. But I wonder how you feel about the album now as you look back on that as...
I think I feel exactly as I felt at the time, that it was a very nice way of ending things because it contained a lot of work from Rick in particular, which I thought was really important. And, I just don't think there's an appetite. Even if we were to say we're going to go back on the road and play or whatever, the prospect of making records anymore just seems such a waste of time. Live music is where the industry is now, and to spend a year developing music so that someone else can pirate it or whatever, I think, well, why bother?
It does seem that from the way that you guys worked and the inordinate amount of time it took to get albums out, that you look back on that now, that whole process, and it is a kind of an anachronism, isn't it, really?
Yeah. Well, I say that. I think there are still people who spend an awful lot of time making records, but that tends to be more with the construction of them rather than the actual physical recording of them.
Let's talk a little bit about, you talked about performance, and Roger Waters is doing that gig in the desert. The sort of, I think it's called Coachella for old people, with the Who, Neil Young, Paul McCartney. Do you think you might make an appearance on that?
If asked, I probably would, but I'm not holding the date at the moment.
Because you showed me just before we started shooting, you showed me a wonderful video with you and Roger. And I think, the number of times that you and I have talked about the difficulties that, the band had with Roger, and the fact that he was grumpy and, a bit of a control freak and all those things. We've talked about that a million times before. But we're going to see a clip of this.
I've heard rumours.
It shows a real friendship and warmth between the two of you.
We met in 1962, so there's a point at which, if you've known people for that long, and of course I knew him before we were even in a band together, so hopefully sort of friendships transcend musical differences, as we call them.
Well, yes, but it's taken a while to get there, hasn't it?
Yeah, but there we are.
Do you miss that idea of playing? I mean, playing live. If you were to be asked, I mean, is it something that you miss?
Not really, because I still have opportunities to play now and again. And I certainly don't miss the whole thing of... I really enjoy touring, but it's not something where I pine for it. Been there, done it, and it's a great thing and really exciting. But no, I don't. There's so much, there's lots of other stuff to do.
Like what?
Like play with cars, work with other musicians, do flying, whatever. I mean, every day has got endless things to do and that seem worthwhile. I've spent a lot of time, well, not a lot of time, but some time on music politics with something called the Featured Artists Coalition, which is trying to really to lobby government, probably in particular, but in terms of artists' rights, particularly where young artists are concerned, and to try and improve the music industry and make it more, just make it work better for young musicians, because at the moment it's far more difficult than it ever was in our sort of start-up period.
Tell us a bit more about what that involves for you.
What does it involve for me? I suppose it involves really spending a certain amount of time reading and talking and meeting in order to explain the position of music in the 21st century, because people have pretty simplistic views of pop music. They assume that if you are a rock musician at any level, you probably have a Rolls-Royce that you drive into a swimming pool on a regular basis. But what's extraordinary is that, 40 years ago, it was unthinkable that you would charge more for a ticket to a show than you would for a CD. CD was for life, it would last forever. And a show was ephemeral. But now, the show ticket for a dozen bands is almost any money you want to charge. And the music is virtually a giveaway, a promotional giveaway. And for a young band, of course, that makes it really tough, because they're not making any money off the recorded music, and they certainly aren't in a position to charge anything, maybe, for live music. So what you get are more and more bands that are basically amateur bands, even though they're really doing quite well. I mean, I don't know how much you want to go into this, but there's a sort of sea change that the record companies initially would sign young talent. And so it was sort of, it was more like venture capital, if you like. Whereas now, you can't get a record deal unless you can already show that you've got a fan base, you've got a Facebook page, you've probably made your own record and sold it yourself and so on. So it's really tough compared to compared to, let's say, the 60s.
I know a lot of bands, in fact, quite a few bands that we've invited on to the Friday Night Rock Show, who seem to be quite successful. They've got, thousands of people on Twitter, thousands of people on Facebook. There's a real buzz about them. And yet they can't afford to move out of their parents' home. They're still living at home.
They're what?
I mean, it's
what would have been bands in the Melody Maker, which would have been professional bands, who are still amateur bands, basically, meaning they can't make a living at it, although they're perfectly talented and capable and everything else.
Weren't you fortunate? Do you ever think about how fortunate you were, as I was actually, being born at that time when rock was just beginning? We were. I think we were fortunate.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. I think there was there was actually a golden period, which is the one where you were able to sell vinyl initially and then move on to a cassette and then sell it in CD finally.
More from Nick Mason in a couple of minutes. Nick Mason. We've known each other for a very long time, and I've always sort of considered you as a sort of rock's equivalent of a sort of gentleman farmer, in a sense, that you sort of, I don't know, you've always sort of you've always looked down on, I don't mean look down in a pejorative way, but you've kind of observed. Yes, you've been detached, a bit detached from it all, sort of looking down at the kind of absurdity.
I think that's the name of drummers. They sit at the back, watching. Gary Wallace always described a band as a bass player and a drummer and then a group of novelty acts, which I thought sort of put it rather well. I think you have a different perspective if you're sitting behind. You get to see a lot more of what's going on maybe than if you're fronting.
I always imagine you sort of looking at all this stuff that went on, particularly in the kind of the ridiculous, heyday, well, not the ridiculous heyday, but the heyday of, the huge tours and stuff, and sort of looking at all of this leviathan that you had around you and sort of, this is mad.
Yeah, I know. I never looked at it and thought this is mad. I thought this is good, because I think, in some ways, we did achieve an awful lot of what when we set out, I don't think we envisaged where we were going to end up at all. What's so great is to be given the opportunity to do the next step. So you move from club to theatre, from theatre to arena, from arena to finally stadium, and try and be able to put on these shows. Now, being wise after the event, I think stadium shows are never quite as good. Actually, they're better now because, of course, there's so much technology now that's available that wasn't available then. But funnily enough, I was at Radio City Music Hall last week and looking at that, which of course is a wonderfully sort of antiquated theatre, but actually it worked brilliantly. And I remember playing there sort of 40 years ago, I guess it was, but they had a stage that dropped. It was 27 foot, so you could actually have your audience come into a bare arena, more or less, or theatre, and then the whole stage set would rise from nothing. I mean, it was fabulous, absolutely fabulous. And they had steam curtains and all sorts of technology that was extremely old, but worked extremely well.
Speaking of theatres, I mean, the one thing that Pink Floyd have not done, which a lot of other bands have done, Pink Floyd the musical. I mean, you've had...
It's the dancing, Nicky. It's the dancing that always held us back.
I've seen your dancing. It's pretty neat. But, I mean, surely you've been approached. The Kinks have done it, ABBA, the Beatles, Queen. Is the time not right, Nick Mason, for Pink Floyd the musical? You must have been approached.
I don't think so. I mean, it's not something that...
Then we should think about this,
Maybe. It doesn't sort of fill me with excitement and... No.
It is such a wonderful story.
The worry is that you sort of trivialise it. And I'm not... I've seen a number of the shows, and I have to say that they're fun and some are really good. But they're not as good as the real thing. And I suppose what I find odd is that, towards the end of the show, it all sort of gets a little bit looser, and everyone's on stage, but it's not real, And actually, I think quite a lot of people go to the theatre and see these things and feel as though they've been to a rock concert, but actually they're very, very different experiences. And there's something sort of an ersatz rock.
But you are the keeper of the Pink Floyd archive. I mean, you've got tons of stuff, haven't you?
I've got a lot, but not. It's not as beautifully done as, let's say, David Bowie did in terms of keeping things and keeping a record of them, or Bill Wyman, who also kept really good.
Yeah.
I just kept more stuff than the others.
But is there potentially a sort of an exhibition, or I mean, something like the Stones have done?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that could be one of the things everyone's beginning to look at, because it can be. I thought the David Bowie exhibition in particular was fantastic, and there were elements of the Rolling Stones exhibition that I saw recently, and which I also thought was really. And I have to say that would interest me a lot more than a musical. I keep thinking of the dancing.
Well, we look forward to that. Nick Mason, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.